Good afternoon and welcome to CMI's Brexit Teach-In, where we'll be talking about the current state of play in Brexit negotiations and the skills and behaviours that managers are going to need to flourish post-transition period. We've got a fantastic panel for you today. I'm really excited. But before I introduce you, I would just say that if you would like to get involved, please do drop us a question for the panel in the live chat to the right of your screen. We will try to get through as many as we can at the end of the session. And also just to let you know that we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing it with you shortly afterwards if you'd like to revisit it and see about some of the stuff that we've discussed. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel. Today I'm joined by Sally Jones, who is the Trade Strategy and Brexit Leader for EY UK. We've got Stephen Pearce, who is Deputy Managing Director and Chief HR Officer at Hitachi Europe. And we've got Toby Payton-Jones, OBE, who is an Ambassador for Siemens and a Non-Executive Director for the Department for Education. So thank you very much for joining me all. I'm very excited for our discussion today. Before we get into the meat of it about skills and behaviours, I wonder if we can come to you, Sally, and kind of have a bit of a scene setter just for 10 minutes. Obviously, Brexit's back in the media this week. Negotiations are perhaps ramping up, perhaps crunch time, who knows. But what do managers need to know about what's currently happening and where we're going to be next year?
Sure. So there's a handful of themes that I want to pick up on here. Let's start with the Brexit negotiations and how well or otherwise they're going. So, brief recap, the two sides negotiators agreed that they'd reached the end of the road of what they could achieve from a technical perspective and punted the ball to their political leaders, Boris Johnson in the UK and Ursula von der Leyen in the EU, because those last three remaining issues, which are governance, level playing field and fishery rights, are no longer technical issues, they've become political. The Prime Minister and Mrs. von der Leyen had a meeting by telephone over the weekend in which they resolved to kick that ball back again to the negotiators. And if you wanted to speculate to yourself about how valuable such a thing would be, given the negotiators themselves have said they've done all they can, well, that wouldn't be, you wouldn't be unique in doing that. So the negotiations continue. Monsieur Barnier, the chief negotiator for the EU side, briefed EU ambassadors this morning very, very pessimistically. So there is evidently a number of points of dispute. Things haven't yet unlocked. The real question becomes, when is really the last day for these things to unlock? The European side is saying it's Thursday, the 10th, which is the opening day of the European Council. Is it really the 10th? You know, we were all told that it was the 26th of November, but before that, the 23rd, before that, the 15th, before that, the 31st of October, before that, the 15th of October, before that, if we didn't have a deal by mid-September, then it was all disastrous. The only actual legislative deadline is 31 December, when the transition period ends at 11 p.m. UK time. And in theory, we have up until then. One piece of speculation over the weekend was what would happen if the ratification process hadn't been completed by that point in time. There are actually processes both sides for implementation awaiting ratification to take place. So that's not actually as much of a concern as some people seem to think it is. So the theme number one is it's still going on after all these years. The second theme, though, is that in lots and lots of regards, don't be fooled into thinking a deal is going to make a great deal of difference, because it isn't. So we tend to talk about 10 Brexit domains, and I always panic at this point that I'm going to forget one or more of them, but we always talk about the 10 domains as deep breath: supply chain, trade in goods and customs, trade and services, IT systems and data, people and management, your guys, contract and legal, compliance and regulatory, Northern Ireland, commercial and pricing, and tax and finance. Whoa, so 10. And if you think about those 10, what a deal would do for us is it would produce a situation of the possibility of zero tariffs. And it might also help with a bit of the logistics and distribution around things like hauliers' driving licenses and permits for moving goods into and out of the EU and the UK for the driver, the truck. But that's pretty much all that it brings. All of the other 10 Brexit domains, with tariffs as that noticeable exception, still remain significantly different from 1 January compared to how they are now. So for most businesses, in most regards, profound change is coming anyway, and to remain focused on the outcome of the deal negotiations means you risk missing some fairly important points. The third point I wanted to pick up on, third and final point you'll be glad of, Will, recognizing time is pressing on, is that businesses are a lot less ready now than they were in the run up to 31 October and 31 January. And that's not their fault. It's not their fault at all. It's been caused by external factors, of which COVID is by far the most profound. That's really, really caused issues for businesses. Secondly, they don't have the working capital now to rebuild their Brexit preparations. And our clients are telling us anecdotally that they can't afford to tie up their working capital supporting their suppliers or building a stockpile. But equally anecdotally, when I talk to companies that make and sell pallets, they are telling us that they are not seeing that huge outflow of pallets from their resources that indicated stockpiles were building up last time. So there's definitely fewer resources there for Brexit planning. And then we've got the fact, and I feel slightly guilty saying this with Toby on the line, but then we've still got the fact that the government has not yet released sufficient information for businesses to be fully prepared. And we see that, for example, in the fact that the systems that hauliers and traders are going to need to be able to access in order to simply file the paperwork they need to file in the UK was supposed to go live today and has been deferred to the 23rd of December for release. So there is simply no way a British haulier or trader can access that system now to see if they are registered for it properly, if they can pull out the right information from their systems, where to find it. They can't do that until the 23rd of December at the earliest. And that's the kind of problem which no business can contend with.
Okay, fascinating. And you answered so many of my questions just in that one piece.
Oh, sorry.
So it's great. No, it's great. So I guess the point that I want to underline is what you said about that, the kind of the idea that a deal represents normality and what we're used to at the moment. That's completely, am I right in saying, not the case? And
it is not the case.
So absolutely. So regardless, we have to be ready for change, and we need to be kind of do you think that I know the government's information campaign, the slogan is check, change and go. Do you think kind of businesses that are using the government's resources and looking at those kind of tools, have they got enough information to be making those, like to be checking and making those changes, or is that kind of available at the moment?
Some is, some isn't. So again, first point to make is that there is an asymmetry between the level of preparations that the UK government has done and the level of preparations that have been done on the EU side. So, for example, on the 29th of October, France, the Netherlands, Belgium and Ireland hosted an all-day webcast. And oh my God, it was dull. But they hosted an all-day webcast in which they explained the systems that they'd created, how they'd tested the systems, what was required to register with the systems, what website you need to go to register, what information you need to register with, what information will be required to submit a declaration, what testing they've done of the systems to check they were robust, where you can get the information from your own internal systems on a most probable basis, how long it would take a truck to cross the border afterwards with the systems in place compared to now, the process checks that they've done to test it, and the number of officials that they'd had to recruit and train in order to make it a viable system, and how that was all going. And it took about 8 hours. It was deeply turgid, but important. And that's just, we have nothing equivalent to that. And that's just goods. Then you start moving into the whole services arena. So services are even harder to manage change for than goods, because goods, you're dealing with a set of at border barriers that are well understood and defined. With goods, what you're doing is you're looking at the changes that will apply in individual member states. So if you're providing services into Europe, you're not just looking at one set of changes, you're looking at having to review the changes in every single domestic regime that is relevant to you, which could be all 27 member states, could be 31 if you include the EEA, some of which aren't written in English, some of which have never been translated into English from home state language. And that starts to become even harder for businesses to try and prepare for at that point in time.
Perfect, cool. Okay, well, but just before we move on from the scene set, CMI's done a bit of polling with our members, and I wanted to run some of the stats past you just to kind of get your takeaway and see what you think. I think the key one for this discussion, we asked our members whether their organisation are prepared for the end of the transition period and for kind of Brexit itself. 80% told us that they are prepared, and 9% told us that they were not. And that 9% has remained stubborn since about kind of mid last year or so. So I'm going to give you that one. And then there's another stat I'll give you at the same time, which is 63% of our managers have reported that the best outcome from an economic perspective is for a deal to be made. So I guess from what you just said then, and particularly on that latter stat, is there that big differential between the economic outcomes of a deal and a no deal? And do you have any kind of feelings about the businesses that feel prepared versus those that don't?
Yeah, so starting with the economics, they are absolutely right. It is better to have a deal than not to have a deal from an economic perspective, purely because of those tariffs. And they can be really high on some products, particularly in the agri-food sector. You know, they're prohibitively high, but automotive also famously has called out the 10% tariffs and on components as being particularly painful. Others have their own pinch points too. So yes, without a doubt, from an economic perspective, the tariffs do make a difference. On the first point about whether businesses are really ready, I would genuinely challenge the 80% as to whether they really are as ready as they think they are. And certainly the conversations that we're having with our clients now are often not about customs and supply chain, which are the ones that people do feel on top of. But all of our conversations at the minute are now being driven by commercial and pricing, which is literally, my costs are going to go up no matter what. I need to work out how much I have to absorb and how much I can put onto my customers and how much I need to push back onto my suppliers. What are my competitors doing? Or it's around IT systems and data, where there are some really profound changes that companies aren't really on top of, or it's regulatory and compliance. So I've got clients in my portfolio now who have been prepared for supply chain and customs for a long time, but who have realized that they have not currently got a legal structure that allows them to meet the legal law requirement for them to lawfully sell their products or services into the EU from 1 January. And that's not just, in inverted commas, an additional cost. That is, it will not be lawful for them to sell their products from 1 January, absent taking really quite stringent steps to get the right structures in place. So, you know, these are businesses, if we'd spoken to them 3 months ago, would have said they were ready.
Perfect, cool. Well, so I guess to close the section off, just one line, what do you think is the most important takeaway for managers watching now? Is there one, either like one action they need to take now, or is it to, as you say, interrogate yourselves properly and actually think about what's going to happen?
Yeah, it's interrogate yourself properly across those 10 Brexit domains. Not all of them will apply to everybody, but think broadly across all 10 Brexit domains. And then, if I could add a second piece of advice, don't look to be great at this point. Don't even look to be good. Just look to be good enough keep the lights on.
Perfect. And I'll give you a little plug. I believe those 10 Brexit domains are on EY's website if managers didn't note them down. So yes, head over there to kind of put together your checklist. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sally. Well, so let's get into the main meat of the session then, which is the skills and the behaviors that individual managers are going to need to demonstrate to flourish and kind of get through the next year. Stephen, perhaps I can come to you first. What's your initial feeling on that? What do you think individuals are going to need to demonstrate to really rise to the top in their organizations across the next year?
Sure. No, thank you, Will. I think that a key point here around Brexit is the way that we view it as organisations. And I think it's become such a political issue. People have been polarised about their views, and we, in some senses, we've maybe lost the focus on what we're trying to do as organisations. What I've been saying for a long time is that organisations need to see Brexit as a change management process, because that's what it is. You know, putting aside all the other noise that's around it, and with change management. And I think to answer your question, well, that's really the skill that managers need in the year ahead, is how do you change your organization from where it has been for a long time to the new world? And as Sally has said, we don't know every detail about what that new world is going to look like. But neither do we know every detail about any change. And if we look at this year and COVID and all the issues we've been through this year, and we couldn't possibly have foreseen that. And we've learned as we've gone along. We've changed as we've gone along. We've engaged people. We've communicated. We've been through those sort of change management stages that you'd expect. And I think the key skill we need for the year ahead is good leadership around change management. If we do that well, then we recognise that we do need to raise our game around communication. We do need to ensure that we are leading and communicating and engaging the evolving people through that process. We do recognise that we need to learn and adapt as we go, that we need to be flexible, but also resilient through the change process. And we do need to recognise that some people will struggle with all of that, and ensure that we do the right thing to keep them with us. So I think the key point here, Will, is around how do we create change, and this is another change process that we need to go through.
Perfect, thank you, Stephen. Toby, perhaps I can come to you with the same question. What do you think are kind of the key skills, top management skills that we'll need?
Yeah, well, Sally's laid out quite a challenging picture, and I think you know, Sally, you've done that really well, both in terms of what we know, but also what we don't know. And those that think they've got 80% ready, 20% is already quite a lot that you don't know about. So I think what we can say is that managing disruption in a big way is to prepare for that disruption. It's not the first time we've been disrupted. So think about what it is that we need to do to manage and experiment our way through, rather than throwing all our toys out of the pram and saying, oh, we didn't know this and we weren't told that, and pointing outwards. There's quite a lot of preparation we can do in terms of being ready for disruption with our communication with customers, supply chains, etc., to manage the fallout. So the other bit of it, of course, is rather like a merger or acquisition, is a kind of big checklist management, getting very organized with a checklist, a project management approach to this. But in terms of the skills now, we're really talking about a situation when you combine it with COVID, where there is both speed, complexity, and a huge amount of uncertainty. And what does that tell you about the way you need to manage? Well, I can tell you, I studied zoology originally, and the response to a very rapidly changing situation that's very uncertain and very complex is fear. And we are very much under the skin you will see that fear response. You've seen it with COVID, but you will see it right across. And therefore, how we respond as managers in terms of looking at that fearful response, being able to manage risk, structural change will be a big topic for many organizations, and that will create job uncertainty for people. And one of the most important things will be the way we communicate, not just what we communicate, the ability to build trust, not only with our employees, but with our stakeholders as well. And probably worth mentioning is that Brexit, once we're through the kind of immediate disruption, is probably the least of our problems. Some of the biggest disruptions are happening around that will continue. The disruptions caused by technology, cocktail of different technologies, of climate change and the decarbonisation of our economy. So I think once we're through the immediate disruption, those bigger challenges will remain, and that's going to be very important for management to bear in mind that this is a crisis within a much bigger set of global trends.
Thanks, Toby. So Sally, you've been cursed to answer the same question for the third time, but what I will say is that kind of the speed and complexity and uncertainty that Toby is talking about, I imagine is a kind of key tenet of what you look for kind of in that business advisory role, and when you're helping your clients and you're looking for members to join your team. I wonder if that kind of, is there any learnings from there and how you bring in new skills into your organization about what we then are looking for Brexit?
Well, it's a really interesting point, because what my team do is actually trade strategy advice. So we help clients to manage all of those disruptions that Toby mentioned, the rise of digital, servicification, the collapse of the WTO system and international norms, China-US disputes, all of that kind of stuff. Brexit is to us actually quite a localized little spat. Very important to us, but really not very important to the rest of the world in the general scheme of things. And because the UK has been a member of the EU for 45 or so years, we in this country don't have many people who are skilled in trade. So in creating my team, I've actually had to also create all of the trainings and learnings they need to get up to speed. I would much rather have a keen and enthusiastic first year straight out of school or university who wants to learn about trade and has an appetite for it and Brexit and commercial realities than someone of 10 years standing who's having Brexit foisted upon them reluctantly, would rather be doing almost anything else within EY, and is there on sufferance. So I think the thing I've learned more than anything else is that coalitions of the willing in every context, but this one in particular, because of its severity and its speed requirements, are much, much more productive and effective than coalitions that are from necessity instead.
So that's almost the attitude that that your kind of teammates, colleagues, whatever, coming in with. So that's just as important as the skills that they provide.
On things like Brexit, yes, totally.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, that kind of brings us back to what Toby was saying about the kind of the politicization of the debate and how we've become polarized discussing it. So it's very interesting. Stephen, I wanted to come back to you because you spoke in your answer about communication, the importance of clear communication. This is something CMI recently published our flagship research project, which was on how COVID has affected the roles and priorities and skills of managers, looking both pre and post pandemic. We found that about 95% of the people we spoke to said that clear communication was the most important trait right now and will only become more important in the future. From your experience, Stephen, are there any principles or top tips or kind of any absolute laws in your mind that you've always kind of kept front and center when you're communicating across your career?
Sure. Yes, thanks, Will. And certainly communication has been a big issue through COVID, as you say. It's been interesting, whilst it's on that list at the very top, as you just mentioned in that survey, I've seen other research which has said in employee surveys, communication this year has been more highly rated than in previous years, because I guess companies have had to try harder. And I've certainly seen it in the feedback from our employee surveys too. Doesn't mean we're necessarily great at it, but we're better at it because we've had to be. So I think that's, in one sense, is a positive, but it's not enough, clearly. And I think some of the principles of communication that have become clear through this current period of COVID, and will become even more important through Brexit, first of all, is to always communicate more than you think you need to. I think leaders of organizations, and we're all guilty of this, because we know something, there's an element of we assume other people will probably know it too, and typically they don't. And even if they do, they want to be told it. And not to be concerned about repetition, again, because good communication is about repetition of the same message, maybe slightly different ways, but ensuring that we get clarity across the organization. I think another principle I have is to avoid surprises. I think the worst communication is where we drop something on a group of people or an individual, and when we've been able to communicate it sooner, but we've chosen not to. Obviously, certain things you can't because they're confidential. But typically, to communicate openly and transparently, which also builds trust, of course, but to ensure that when we actually get to a point where something happens, people have seen it coming because they recognise it's an option. Now, that's not to worry everybody with every concern, but there are certain things where you certainly want to keep your leadership team and maybe a wider group aware of what's happening. So being honest, being transparent, being authentic about the way we communicate. And I guess the other thing to say is it's important that it's two-way. Often we talk about communication in organizations and we think it's about us telling, and clearly it isn't enough to do that. And I think COVID has certainly shown that it needs to be a two-way communication. And the best leaders through COVID that I've seen are those who've communicated really well, but in a two-way fashion. They've listened as well as telling. And it's been fascinating, actually, some things that we've learned from that. Two things particularly that may still be relevant given the way we're working for the future, foreseeable future. The first thing is when you ask somebody how they are, not to believe the first thing they say. And I think that's a great principle. And the second is to recognize that when people are working remotely, you don't know who else is around. And it's amazing what people will say to you when they're in a room one-to-one. They won't say when they're on a screen. You don't know who else is around the house who's listening, who may have maybe cause some concerns or whatever to that individual, and they're not telling you what's really on their mind. So I think it's recognizing that, as I've heard the term used several times, I've used it a lot, I think it's great, is that we're all in the same storm, but in different boats. And I think that absolutely applies to COVID, and it also will apply to Brexit. That's, maybe where our boats are organizations rather than individuals to some extent within the Brexit context. But the same thing applies. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of turbulence. We need to recognize that individuals, groups, organizations are different, and to accommodate, support, and work with them in different ways depending on where they are. Perfect.
Cool. Thanks, Stephen. That's great. It's really practical, and I will 100% steal that little catchphrase you've got there.
You're most welcome.
So Toby, I now want to come back to you. You spoke about the fear factor, particularly around COVID. About Brexit and to a certain extent COVID as well. We are potentially entering a period with economic prospects potentially very likely to be different, potentially negative. I wanted to talk to you about difficult conversations. I think it's something that managers may be faced with next year. If you were giving advice to a manager who perhaps has been maybe lucky enough never have to really do any difficult conversations, or whether you're a manager that is either facing a change in your role or perhaps the prospect of losing the role, what advice would you be giving either for the person that is leading that conversation, and then also how you can receive it and still turn it into something positive?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just like to kind of step back a little bit from that specific conversation. And I think that would be one of the first things I would do is stand back. If you're facing a very uncertain world, then as a leader, we have this archetypal view of the visionary leader who has an idea about where they're going and what the right answers are. And potentially, when you're facing a very uncertain, complex world, a visionary leader could be the most dangerous person in the room. And that most organizations, when you're facing a very complex problem, need to absolutely harvest the collective intelligence of the organization, and that being able to have inclusive, open discussions, authentic discussions about the problems you're facing are very important. So creating the climate in which those conversations can take place makes a difficult conversation then more possible. In fact, it becomes more of an everyday thing as people face a fearful future, not something that in good times comes out of the blue, where we've now got to have a difficult conversation. We're having those conversations because we've created a climate in which, yeah, I, the leader, actually, I'm not sure how this is going to play out. And that's very, very important. Most people can put up with uncertainty if they know when it's going to end. And of course, in the kind of futures that we're looking at the moment, very difficult to know when it's going to end or how it's going to end. So as a result, we have to create certainty, maybe not in the end point, but certainty in each other, certainty in how we behave towards each other, the way we support each other, and the process we go through in making decisions. So in having that difficult conversation, it should then become, as I was saying, something natural, something that involves listening as much as talking, because I, the leader, don't necessarily have the answers. And that's something that we're going to get through and do together. And so that's very much the mindset that I would approach it. And I think it's very important to think that if you haven't done your preparation for that, you haven't got that culture right. And I think Stephen's right, that people have made big efforts to try and create a different climate during COVID, a more supportive, open, inclusive, conversational climate. Then those conversations are going to be a lot harder. The last thing I would say is don't be frightened about the law. Legislation actually holds us back, particularly if you're talking about structural change. People feel I need to have all my ducks in a row before I can go and talk with an employee about how this might impact their job. In my experience, and certainly in Siemens, the way we tend to do things is to go much further ahead of that, to share the challenges the company's facing, and to ask for ideas as we start to come up with things, and to, in many ways, anticipate the kind of discussions that we're already having. So there's some thoughts, Will.
Perfect. Thanks, Toby. That's great. I think I just want to ask Stephen one very quick question before we move on from this section, and that is around kind of recognition and getting yourself noticed within your organization. So just before we leave kind of this communication subsection, Stephen, what do you want to see from a manager who feels they are ready to step up, kind of can perhaps see the uncertain landscape we're facing and feels like either they have a contribution to make or that they would like to be in a more secure position in the organization by moving up? What kind of things do you want to see from someone that's trying to get noticed?
Sure. I think a lot of the same characteristics as perhaps we would normally see, but more so given the situation we're in. Again, going back to the change management situation, you want people who are willing to put their hand up, to get involved, to volunteer, to be on the same side and part of the coalition, the coalition of the willing, or whatever you want to call it, the people that want to get involved to make it happen. And there's always people that will watch and see what happens, and others who make things happen. And if you want to get on, you've got to be on the side of the people that make things happen, and not be an observer. I think it's having a can-do attitude. So again, it's easy to be negative, it's easy to nitpick, it's easy to criticize. It's much harder to recognize the positives and find ways to move things forward, even though you may not have all the information that you want at that particular time. I think it's those who will take responsibility and get things done, not wait to be given responsibility, but actually look to where they can contribute. And back to the point about communication, be a great communicator, be a great team leader, a great manager, somebody who ensures that they are transparent and authentic in how they work with their broader team. Because in the end, we're only as successful as the people around us and the people that we lead and the people that we work with. And so it is about developing those connections and effective network and working well as a part of a wider group. I mean, there's a lot there, Will, but I think those are some of the characteristics that I would look for amongst somebody who really wants to get on and make a difference.
Cool, perfect. Thanks, Stephen. So I'm going to move on, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit already around COVID. But first, I just want to say I can see we've had some fantastic questions coming in through the chat, some really great engagement. Please do keep putting them in, and I hope that we can spend about the last 15 minutes we've got kind of going through them and trying to give you as many practical answers as we can. But so, Sally, in your opener, we kind of spoke about how the pandemic has drained some of the, from one perspective, like the stockpiles that companies have built up before Brexit, and presumably it's drained some of the bandwidth from companies being able to think about and prepare for. I mean, do you think that from your clients, have you seen any shift, any slight positive from the pandemic in terms of giving them that real world stress test, which has taught them what they don't know and what they need to consider more? Is there any positives drawn out from that perspective?
I'd actually flip it on its head and say that all of the preparations people did for Brexit in the run up to 31 October and 31 January turned out to be brilliant preparations for COVID, particularly when those supply lines were under intense pressure in March and April of this year. And people did use stockpiles that they wouldn't have had without Brexit. And by people, I mean organisations rather than individuals. And people were able to be much more nimble in switching their supply lanes when they needed to very quickly than they would have been without Brexit. So without a doubt, the two are intertwined. What I think is really important to understand about the end of the transition period is that the companies that are going to be most immediately and negatively impacted are not the same as the companies who are currently being most negatively impacted by COVID. So in a COVID situation, it's about hospitality, leisure, tourism, a little bit of retail, although some of the online retailers are doing really quite well. Brexit disruption in January is going to be driven entirely by supply chains and goods. And it will be those companies that make perishable goods or sell perishable products in particular that are really struggling. So it's going to be agri-food, it's going to be medicines, it's going to be cold chain supply. You know, there is a reason why the government is saying Pfizer vaccines are going to have to be airlifted in. It's because they can't afford to be sitting for 2 days outside the Channel Tunnel. So it's Brexit on top of COVID is a really negative set of combination of factors because the two have got different impacts on different parts of the economy.
Okay, cool. Stephen and Toby, I might bring you in on that question as well. Maybe we'll start with Stephen. What do you think? Have you, from the reaction from your company and from your peers, do you think we're slightly better prepared?
Well, I think we're getting there, but I think we need to recognise this is an ongoing learning process, Will. Because however much we try to be prepared, I think there's an element with this whole Brexit thing that we kind of don't believe it till it's going to actually happen, because we've had so many false dawns, as Sally has said. You know, we've been ready and then it hasn't happened, and then the second time we probably didn't quite get as ready because we thought it may not happen, and now we're at the point of we know it's going to happen, but we're still not quite ready. And I think there's a lot to do between now and the end of the year, but there's no question it's going to be a disruptive period from the 1st of January for a period of time. And also think about people moving around. I mean, Sally's talked about quite rightly about perishable goods and so on. But have we got our passports ready with more than 6 months on them? Typically, we haven't needed that in the past. From the 1st of January, we will need that. So there's all sorts of little details that perhaps we haven't really thought about yet. We're going to have to think about in the coming weeks. So I think there needs to be a recognition out there that this is going to be a learning process, and this is not about here's a big communication in December. Even if we do get a deal, here's a communication that's everything you ever need to know about Brexit, because that will not be the case. It'll be, this is what we understand for today, but here are the things we still need to work on, and we still need groups of people looking at what's going to happen from January, learning from it, implementing change, and communicating and taking people with us. So it's going to be an ongoing process. It does not end on the 1st of January.
Cool. Well, Toby, I might rephrase slightly for you. So one of the questions that we had pre-submitted before the webinar was what leadership strategies are best used in uncertain times like COVID and like Brexit? I guess, like, what qualities do you want to see from the leaders of your organisation, those kind of people around you?
Well, I guess you know, both Sally and Stephen have you know, hinted at that very strongly in terms of what's needed. We're used to a world in which we can plan, and we can only plan so much. And the things that we can plan, we absolutely should plan and be very rigorous about it with proper project management and checklists. But the other part of it, which we're not so good at, is what I would call the risk management side of leadership, having proper risk registers, managing those risks, but also having what I would call very fleet and very fast first-time fix teams that you can experiment your way into the future, because that's what we're going to have to do. Things go wrong. It's fed into the team. They develop a solution. You can then roll out and deploy that solution within the organization as rapidly as possible, because the preparation for that team to be able to take in very often cross-functional teams, you know, a team with legal, with HR, with all sitting in that team can take in these problems, crunch them through, and deploy solutions very rapidly. So you set yourself up as a rapid learning organization. And, you know, that's not just a mindset for an individual, because it is about an individual. It's a mindset as a leader for your team, but it's also an organizational topic that you need. We're going to need an organization that's going to be very flexible, that already has docking stations with our main stakeholders, and that those docking stations are set up to deal with what's going to hit us. So that's definitely the way in Siemens we've been kind of dealing with things. Of course, we've kind of built some new warehousing for bonded warehouses in case of this disruption happening. We've taken some measures, but we really don't know how it's going to play out. But we have set up a lot of contingency in order to deal with it in a way of working.
Fascinating. Cool. So I'm going to try and sneak in one more question before we move on to our audience questions. This one is around diversity and inclusion. And so going back to Management Transformed, which I've discussed earlier, 10% of UK managers pre-pandemic believed that diversity and inclusion in the workplace is a critical workplace priority, compared to 39% of Black managers. And then when we asked that question again after the pandemic, both of those figures had slipped to 7% and 35% respectively. And so I wonder, perhaps I'll start with you, Sally, just do you recognise kind of that slippage that's occurred during the pandemic? And do you, is there anything you've seen with any of the clients you've spoken to, any conversations you've had? Could you speculate on a cause? And if you were going to reverse it, what would you do?
So let me start by reflecting on what I've seen within my firm, which actually has been that it's not been the pandemic which has triggered conversations. It's been the Black Lives Matter movement. And speaking entirely frankly, it made us take a really hard look at ourselves, and we didn't like what we saw a lot. We really didn't like what we saw. We took a very conscious decision maybe 5 years ago to actively promote women, to recruit women, to give them opportunities, to promote women, to bring them into leadership, and it's worked. Our statistics are looking much better. When we look at ethnicity, it's terribly depressing, and genuinely something clearly needs to be done. One of the things that I've been most impressed by over the course of the summer is that it is clearly and evidently both a debate that isn't going away within my firm, and that the leadership are taking seriously to an extent I absolutely wouldn't have believed was possible before. I really, really hope it sticks. I think if it can stick over the course of the COVID summer, it's got a really good chance that it will. When I talk to my clients, they're reflecting exactly the same thing. The one point that I'm very conscious of, though, is that my clients and my firm are among the biggest firms which can afford to dedicate resource to this. And therefore, I don't want to make any assumptions that all firms are in the same position, particularly given your survey results, or that it's easy for smaller firms or less diverse firms to be able to make a big quantum leap when firms that are bigger and resource heavy are struggling to do it. So I genuinely think that the D&I conversation is one that will keep going for a long time, and deserves to and needs to. But it hasn't been COVID that's caused slippage from what I've seen. The whole of the summer has been very much about D&I.
That's really interesting. Stephen, perhaps I could bring you in and say, are there any practical examples of action that managers or companies can take, perhaps SMEs or those smaller organizations that, as Sally says, perhaps doesn't have the resources to have the huge HR teams to support that kind of activity? Are there any, I don't want to say small or easy, because I know none of the meaningful measures are, but are there any measures that you would really bring in and say, this is something I've seen that's worked? Miracle.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be championed, I think, first of all, Will. The challenge, I think, or one of the challenges with D&I is it's like motherhood and apple pie. No one will say they're bad things, yet no one's going to say it's not good. And the stats you quoted, I think probably is because there's so much else going on. It's just not quite as important now, but overall it's as important as it always was, and we've got to sort it out. So it needs to be championed. First of all, and that means a senior leadership championing it, and it needs to be resourced. Again, a lot of us talk about D&I, and then you look at how much money is spent on it in terms of relative investment compared to other projects or other parts of our businesses, and that tells you something, because organisations spend money on the things they really care about, in my view, and so I think those are two basic principles. That any organisation can do. That the resourcing doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be relatively important within the scale of that organisation. But it absolutely has to be led from the top with real sponsorship. It can't be done by an HR team sitting in an office somewhere. However well-meaning and positive an expert they are, it needs leadership.
Cool. Toby, I'd love to bring you in this question, but I think we need to get to the audience question. So I might try and find a specific one for you that you can kind of come back on those points for as well. But yeah, so I'm going to try and quick fire as many of these as I can to you. I think that I will start by saying that we've had a number of very technical questions come in around perhaps import-export duties, kind of key processes. Sally, am I right to say that we perhaps don't have exact certainty on what those processes are right at this point? And if that's the case, do you have any resources or sources of information that you would push our members and managers to find that information?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've spoken about the fact that there's areas of uncertainty. I'm going to call out the British Chamber of Commerce. I was looking down to my side because I have with me, just in case anyone asks difficult questions, their guidance dashboard on Brexit. It is an excellent document. Look up BCC guidance dashboard. And the reason it's excellent is because it sets out in really, really good detail the status of everything you need to know. Where there is certainty, it provides you link to the government's guidance so you can actually look it up and find it. Where there isn't certainty, it tells you so you don't waste your time trying to find something that doesn't yet exist. It answers a huge number of technical questions in the document itself. BCC guidance dashboard, check it out.
Perfect. Sounds great. Toby, when we spoke earlier about the skills managers will need, you spoke a lot about kind of change management, risk management, those kind of principles. We've had a question without a name, which was, which change models do you all prefer and feel will be effective to use in the new year? And if you don't have a particular model, what is the process you work through individually?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's kind of familiar with a number of change models, and the most archetypal one that kind of resonates with people is the change curve and the emotional curve with which people go through. I think that's important from a psychological point of view, but it doesn't necessarily help from an architectural point of view when you're looking at how do you structure your organization for change. And there, where you can really start to see that our what I would call departmental model of having different departments that in a static environment works very well, where each department can effectively streamline and improve its own particular part in the process. That doesn't work when you're actually changing the overall process, because the processes, although the departments work vertically, the processes that go from the product to the customer run horizontally across the organization. So if you're trying to look at models for organizational change, you need to look at how you're going to network your organization in a project structure alongside maybe your departmental structure, or really start to look at how you review all your processes, and therefore structure should always follow process, not the other way around. So that would be, maybe there's the psychological bit, but also the structural bit that I would just point people towards. And of course, there's many other models as well.
Perfect, thanks, Toby. Stephen, we've had a question from Sean Mellows, which was, how will Brexit affect UK engineers who have to work on projects in the European Union? I wonder if with Hitachi, you've kind of looked into any of those issues around staff transfers, staff working in different authorities.
We have somewhat, Will, but I'll have to say I would defer to Sally's comments on this, just because she's clearly spent a lot more time looking at it than I have.
Not a problem at all.
Yeah, happy to take it. Thanks, Stephen. So there's two questions whenever you've got somebody who is looking to perform his or her profession in Europe. For a UK person, the first is, can they physically travel to where they need to be on a timely basis? So if, for the sake of argument, you have the kind of contract that says, we will get a qualified engineer to your plant to do a certified repair within 6 hours, and you can't get somebody a work visa in time, then it's going to cause problems. So physically, can you move people to the right place is question number one. And we know that from 1 January, then the UK is going to have its own points-based immigration system that treats EU citizens like the rest of the world, and each of the EU member states has its own immigration system. So you'll have to go through the hard yards of working out whether you can move a Brit from the UK into the EU on a timely basis, depending on the country concerned, and oftentimes how many days that person has worked in that country prior to this job. Then you've got a separate question, which is, once they are there, can they ply their trade legally because of regulation? Engineering is one of the areas where there will be change coming, because at the moment a British engineer's qualification will be mutually recognised in any of the EU member states as a valid qualification. From 1 January it will not. we know that the draft text that's being negotiated between the UK and the EU does not include mutual recognition of professional qualifications. It does not include MRPQ for engineering qualifications. Therefore, if you've got a British engineer and you want him or her to be working in Europe and their qualification status matters, they will need to requalify.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Ali. Toby, we've had another pre-submitted question, which was around company culture and the benefits and the importance of maintaining that in difficult times. The question kind of said that obviously, well, CMI's president has a fantastic saying, which is that company culture is the sediment of past transactions. With Brexit and with the pandemic to a certain extent, those traditional ways of doing things in the past have changed. Perhaps we're not offering the same products or following the same processes as we have in the past. How do you, well, one, do you see company culture as being an important and valuable aspect of an organization's being? And two, do you have any thoughts on how best you maintain it and build it up in difficult times?
Yeah, it's a great question and absolutely the right question. So my own feeling is that company culture will and already is probably one of the greatest sources of competitive advantage that is sustainable, because it's very difficult to copy and replicate, whereas automation processes and indeed product can very much be replicated. It's also absolutely critical, as we've also talked about, when you're going through a lot of change. So I would say one of the greatest, when I was talking about the visionary leader being potentially the most dangerous person in the room, we still need vision, but we need people actually to be visionary in a slightly different way. And one of the ways is really paying attention to the vision about the culture and the way we work together, how we work with our stakeholders and how we treat each other. And that is becoming an absolutely critical determinant. It's a key task, I would say, of leadership. So what does that mean in practice? And we ran a major culture change program in Siemens when we started to recognize that we were too big and too slow. And the way we set about it was in a very traditional way, top down. We set up project teams with different work streams and a slide deck of 500 slides. And we went about it in the normal way. And it took us a while to realize that you can't change from the old culture to the new culture by using the old culture. So we were literally going about our culture change using exactly the behaviors we had before. And that eventually became both frightening and amusing at the same time. And we completely changed our approach and started to think about a completely unplanned way of working, a much more chaotic approach, a much more inclusive approach that wasn't just bottom up. It was sideways, upwards, downwards, and unrecognizable to the Siemens that we knew before. So I would say it's exactly the right question. I think it doesn't appear on the P&L and balance sheet, but it is probably where value is being created. And it's very important that this won't just take care of itself. You need to think about it and work on it. And there's masses more I could say about this topic, but we are
nearly out of time. Yeah. Don't worry, Toby. We'll do another webinar on this next year. Don't you worry. Guys, that's fantastic. We are nearly out of time. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about disruption. I wanted to end on a positive note. So I was just wondering if we could go around and everyone just say one thing that they've kind of seen plant a seed that has been planted this year that you think is really positive and that we are going to see reaped in 2021? And so, Stephen, I'm going to put you on the spot and give you no time to think about it. What do you think? What's a good thing that's happened this year?
Sure. I mean, I think what we've demonstrated this year, Will, is the ability to change the way we work almost overnight. We've been talking for years about more flexible working and being more agile, and we always found reasons not to do it. With COVID, pretty much every organization that has. And it's demonstrated the ability to do things differently and change. We now need to build on that and create that new normal, whatever that's going to look like, both for COVID and for Brexit. So I think fantastic transformation this year. In many ways, he's very positive about the way we're working.
Perfect. And you, Sally?
Well, on a personal note, I'm really hopeful that by this time next year we'll have stopped talking about Brexit after 4.5 long years of talking about nothing else.
Perfect. And Toby?
Yeah, it's paradoxical that when all our certainties are kicked away, you know, the things that we could really depend on in life just disappear in a way that we never could have imagined. It opens us up also in a way we could never have imagined. Our minds, things that we thought of as being impossible, are possible. And I think that that kind of lesson for us as individuals and as organizations is exhilarating and hugely refreshing.
Perfect. Cool. Guys, thank you so much. It's been so interesting. I could sit here all afternoon and listen to you all, but we've already run over. That is my fault. It's from my bad chairing. But I want to say a huge thanks to you all, Sally Jones, Toby Payton-Jones, and Stephen Pearce. I want to say thank you to Mel and Stacey, who are working backstage at CMI on this fantastic Swish webinar. Thank you for taking all of the stress out of doing this for us. And finally, thank you for everyone that's joined and listened in and submitted your great questions today. I hope it's been useful. As I say, we will send a link to the recording shortly, so you can go back and revisit it if you'd like to. If you're not a CMI member, do check out our website and learn a bit more about our professional network and the career building tools that we offer to our members. And also, if you're not signed up to our free CMI newsletter, that is the way to hear about our latest events and the latest trends in management and leadership as they come out. But that's it. Thank you very much, guys. And I hope to see you all again in the future soon.